let's jump in. Let's really make the use of this hour. So, hello everyone, and welcome to our 9th HWISE-NOW virtual coffee hour. We are so delighted that you've taken time to join us today in our discussion of publication models, metrics, open access, and the implications for team science. It's definitely an ambitious hour, and I hope we have time to even cover most of that. Throughout 2021, we convened several HWISE-NOW episodes with great success. So again, I thank everyone for stopping by, and remember that we have many more engaging conversations booked throughout 2022 with details coming soon. The HWISE-NOW series has been an exciting success that has extended our professional networks and spawned a few research collaborations, and we're hoping to maintain this energy. So for those new to HWISE, I'm Justin Stauber, Associate Professor at the University of Miami in Florida, where I generally study global health disparities from social, environmental, and spatial perspectives. I'm also one of Wendy Jepson's co-pilots of the Household Water and Security Experiences Research Coordination Network, or HWISE-RCN, which is a collaboration that has been going on for years. Drop those links in the chat if you're not familiar to our website and our YouTube site. With the financial support of National Science Foundation, we've built a community of practice that fosters theoretical and methodological advances to study the causes and outcomes of water insecurity at the household scale. I want to acknowledge many contributions from our colleagues in the National Science Foundation funded HWISE-RCN that have helped inspire today's topic. For members of the audience who would like to learn more, please visit our website and join our community. As a reminder, we're recording. You should have all seen that alert already. And after the event, we will post the recording on the HWISE YouTube channel, which is there in the chat, just after the talk. Our format is designed as an informal discussion, and we encourage your questions and comments. So we request that you please type them into the Q&A box or into the chat. We'll be monitoring that throughout the hour. Please feel free to post questions anytime. Our goal is to keep this conversational. And now with that out of the way, let's finally introduce our 4 panelists, each of whom has significant editorial responsibilities that we look forward to learning from. So panelists, as I introduce each of you, please tell us anything you want us to know, but particularly your role at your respective journal and that journal's current or even aspirational publishing model. And let me start with Dr. Leila Harris. She's a professor at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability and the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. Among her many affiliations, she co-directs UBC's program on water governance and is the editor of Environment and Planning E, Nature and Space. Welcome, Leila.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks, everyone. And sorry, I didn't realize everybody was already listening to us in the run-up to the conversation. So most notably, my role, as Justin said, I'm one of the founding editors of Environment and Planning E, Nature and Space, which is part of the SAGE series, Environment and Planning series that you might be familiar with. There's EPA through EPD before us, and now we have EPF as well. So EPE was meant to sort of create a space for critical nature society work, which there are other journals, as we see in the room, that sort of occupied parts of that space, but also a lot of it was quite segmented. So you had conservation and society and other dimensions, but we wanted it to be a bit more integrative. And so that is a for-profit publishing model because it's part of SAGE, which we'll talk more about. And my other sort of significant experience with respect to some of these issues as they were laid out in the characterization of today's talk was in the conversations that happened. I'm on the editorial board for several other journals, including Geoforum. So I was in the room when we had some pretty intense negotiations with Elsevier a few years ago. So I learned and read up quite a bit about these issues at that time. But I don't consider myself an expert in some of the OA debates more generally. A lot of other people that I turn to learn more about those issues. But there was some pretty interesting discussions that went on and experiences that I'm happy to share. And I also have some personal experiences with what I consider more the predatory models, which I'm also happy to speak to, NPTI in particular. So I wouldn't group all the for-profit together, and I wouldn't group all the open access publications together in terms of the very different types of models that exist among them. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Leila. And next I want to introduce Dr. Katie Meehan, who joins us from King's College London, where she is a reader in Environment and Society, and also serves as the Nature and Society editor for Annals of the American Association of Geographers. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks, Justin. I'm Katie Meehan. I'm a geographer at King's College London, and with my editorial hat, I am the Nature Society editor for the Annals of the Association of American Geographers. And a little bit of background for those who are not familiar. The Annals was founded in 1911, so it's an old bird, and it's considered a flagship journal of my discipline in geography. The AAG, the organization I belong to, publishes 4 journals, and the Annals is one of them. But we're published under Taylor and Francis, which is one of these for-profit Big 4 companies, along with some of the others that you'll hear about today. The Annals is very traditional. It's a traditional subscription model. Cost for somebody like me who lives in the UK to publish open access, for example, is roughly £2,400, about $3,200 in US dollars today. So that's just a little bit of background of what the Annals is and where it sits alongside some of the other publications.
Thanks so much, Katie. Next is Dr. Christine Stauber, who's an associate professor of environmental health and serves as associate chair of the Department of Population Health Sciences in the School of Public Health at Georgia State University. Among many things, she is the Walsh section editor for the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Welcome, Christine.
Hello, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I think the journal itself is also older. It's celebrating like a century of publications, and it's a society-focused journal. So the transition to open access under Plan S is a challenge because of the revenue and expense resources. Of course, as the section editor, I don't actually have to contemplate that very much, but it is something that we discuss. And I'm looking forward to this discussion and really looking forward to thinking about this sort of in the context of work that I'm interested in doing, both like as a researcher, as an academician, as a human being around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how this transition is working, and like what does it mean, and what is the intention, and how is that playing out in reality? And just in terms of our page charges, individual members can pay a page charge about $125 per page, but you can also publish open access, and that's $2,500.
Thanks so much, Christine. And of course, last but not least, Dr. Casey Walsh from University of California, Santa Barbara, where he is the chair of the Department of Anthropology, leads the Walsh Water Group, and is co-editor of the Journal of Political Ecology. Welcome, Casey.
Thanks, Justin. So the Journal of Political Ecology was founded in 1994 by 2 anthropologists at the University of Arizona. I have a funny story about being in grad school and looking for this very seminal, important article that was published there, and going to the library and never being able to find it. I looked for years because it was one of the first journals that was online, and nobody was publishing online at that time. So I eventually found it when I got savvy to online publishing as well a few years later. But so it's been in existence about 30 years. We charge nothing to authors, we pay nothing to authors, and we charge nothing to readers. There's no financial transactions except for a little bit of support that I get well, as chair now to help with some editorial assistance that I have in my department to get some of the copy editing done. It really is, as a recent article posed it, a labor of love. It's an exercise in commoning. We're generating a knowledge commons. We're operating in a model of to each to their needs, from each to according to their abilities and possibilities. And the idea is to generate a community that is interested in building this commons. We have, so that's the JPE. I can talk more about that later if anybody's interested.
Okay, thanks so much. Again, we're grateful to have all 4 of you here and to learn from your editorial experiences. And so now, if you'll just indulge me for a minute, I want to open our discussion by painting a picture of the publishing landscape for academic journals, at least as I and many of my colleagues see it and interact with it. So it feels like we're in a transition period. Over the past decade, there's been this explosive growth in the number of open access journals, which has in turn led to many traditional subscription format publishers such as Elsevier, Springer, and Wiley, et cetera, offering their own hybrid models. Others have moved to consortium funding approaches, such as Iowa, the International Water Association's new Subscribe to Open, that was just announced in early 2021. And in that kind of model, a group of institutions fund the publisher to allow open access for all contributors. So there are now a lot of options for scholars to parse, and even more variability in quality. Now, in the HWISE community's publishing space, Iowa's conversion to fee-free open access was a really big move, again, back in the first quarter of 2021. And now PLOS, Public Library of Science, just launched PLOS Water, PLOS Global Public Health, PLOS Climate, and PLOS Sustainability and Transformation, all of which might be appropriate for water scholars. So there's a lot going on. A decade ago, we had to be wary of predatory publishers, but today it's so much more complicated than that. That binary isn't really helpful. The initial success of PLOS and Biomed Central spawned other mega publishers like MDPI, Hindawi, and Frontiers. And many open access titles have respectable impact factors, despite really variable reputations for quality and other questionable practices that really are aimed at driving up those metrics, such as the impact factor. But despite these alleged downsides, people read and really cite these outlets. So this creates new choices between prestigious traditional journals and the reality of we all want to reach the largest possible readership. So finally getting to a question, generally, where is this all heading? And as editors, what are the kinds of conversations that you're hearing about balancing journal reputations in this increasingly metric-driven and dollar-driven academy? Who wants to jump on that first? Leila, can you kick us off? I think you've been doing this the longest.
Well, in terms of where it's all going, I wish I knew. I think what we're seeing, and that what you're signaling as well, is that we have to take a more active role in sort of determining what we would like to do, in terms of taking a collective stance. And so some of the Casey's comments speak to that, but I also think there's been a lot more attention at our professional meetings and others to sort of talking through these issues so we can think about how we want to engage with different models. We do have a lot of very reputable, good options now that are available open access. So it's definitely not the case that we have to just stick with the traditional journal models. Sitting from where I'm sitting, which is a traditional for-profit journal model, we are talking about mentorship. We're talking about a number of the issues in terms of making information more available or broadening in terms of the politics of knowledge, in terms of who can publish there. So those conversations are happening, but I don't feel like we're working beyond at the margins to fundamentally rethinking the model. The conversations with Elsevier were a little bit more fundamental, because the entire editorial boards and so forth were willing to walk away if Elsevier didn't make some concessions, but that was sort of journal by journal. And if you read Wainwright and others' responses to this a couple years ago, when he, and I can't remember who it was, Bram Buscher, decided to leave the editorial board of Geoform, they basically said, we can't do anything journal by journal. We can't just sort of be working at the margins. We have to do this more fundamental shift. So I feel very ambivalent myself personally in terms of how I sit in relation to these questions. I'm very committed to journals like EPE and the Annals and others that I think they play in Geoform. I think they play a key role, and I think they've been really important for our discipline. So I'm not willing to just sort of give up on them and or not review for them, but that's just my personal preference. I respect people making other more committed stands, but I think we also have to talk about that and think about what that looks like in terms of the discipline. So I did want to make one or two notes, which I'll just say now, since Justin asked me to speak first. And one is, even with journals like EPE, if you do not pay the open fee, they're all available at a link, open access. So we've tried to make that clearer to people publishing with us, but it's not loud and clear when, on the website, how to make it available. So the only concession we got, just to make it, to communicate it to authors, is when you receive the acceptance from us now, there's a line that says, your article will be available open access at this link. And I don't know if people pay attention to that, but that's the link they can share on Twitter or others to make it widely available. But it is kind of buried, because otherwise they want you to pay the fee for the gold open access. The other thing that I'll say that I've been very committed to personally is most of our institutions, or at least at UBC, it's very important, they have open access repositories. And within the copyright guidelines, you can share the preprint or other versions. Sometimes it's 18 months and you can actually share the final PDF. So I pay one of my RAs to just look up those guidelines for every article we publish and make the open access version available through our institutional repository, no matter which journal it is. So I still publish in the range of journals, but I always make the open access available on my website. So at least in theory, anyone who wants to get it will be able to find an open access version, even if it's not formatted in the final published version. So those are just two notes I wanted to mention, just in terms of accessibility, which is only one part of the bigger issues at stake, but that's something that we should all be taking more attention to. Thanks.
I can mention the particular situation of the JPE. As you know, as I've explained, it's really not a traditional journal in the sense of how it's managed, or how it's not a for-profit journal. But of course, that always raises the question of how do you get mobilized social labor if you don't have a transaction or wage form going on. And that has been critiqued as well recently in open access, you know, so I'm not going to say that it doesn't exist, that there's other ways to mobilize labor, but they're sometimes dubious. So it's not like open access is always just a fair and you know, the diamond open access or the gold open access is not always such a fair kind of an environment to publish in, but we try our best to be very clear and only work with people who really want to do it. We're not coercing people to do reviews or to publish or anything like that. But that's anyway, having said that, one of the challenges we find is how to then, if we need resources, if I need to hire an assistant to do copy editing, how do we do it? And the challenge I have is that although, for example, the University of California Library is moving, and the University of California is moving towards open access and open publishing, there's no easy way for a journal like us to get access to that, because the libraries like to deal with big consortiums of journals, or they like to deal with the big publishing houses because it's easier. So I'm finding a particular challenge of, you know, there's resources there from the library to support open access, but it's just very difficult for them to come to, paradoxically, a journal that's completely open access that's being managed within the University of California. So, you know, there is this idea of, that we could subscribe to open, but that means you sort of have to organize a whole bunch of open access journals, and you have to then negotiate deals with libraries. That's a lot of work. It's a big challenge, I think, for small journals that are trying to, you know, create a space for themselves to actually engage with libraries and on these kinds of issues. So in a sense, the easiest default position is just to keep doing the work that we do and rely on our own labor, which in the end gets paid for by the university as well. So, but that's a particular challenge we see. And, you know, we do have an e-scholarship platform at the University of California, and others do as well, other universities do, that are there to support, you know, DIY kind of journals, open access journals. But from what I've seen, they're not really taking off. You know, it's just so much work to do it, and it's so difficult to sort of engage with the libraries to find resources for doing the work, you know, the labor of it, that they're not as successful as I think they could be. So there's a lot there still to be worked out between journals like ours, the JPE, and the libraries that are in these big institutions that we work in.
Casey, just following up, do you feel like this is a threat to smaller, you know, university or society affiliated journals as far as being crowded out as libraries increasingly want to negotiate with the Elsevier's of the world? Is that something you talk about?
You know, I think in our particular situation, we're able to keep going because we do have a very committed small group of people who want to do it. But I see it all the time. I see, like, there's journals emerging with a lot more profile and a lot more resources behind them. And then we can talk about metrics as well, and sort of what does it mean to publish in the GPA, and how valuable is that? What's the, you know, compared to another journal? So those are really the threats that I see, that there are journals that that may get more submissions than we do because they're associated with big for-profit publishing. They have a higher profile. And you know, yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question, but those are the threats that I see. I don't even call them threats, because I think in the end, our journal has sort of its own place, but I think new and emergent journals like mine would be very difficult to, or like ours would be very difficult to, would have a hard time, yeah, to establish a position if they don't have a big publisher behind them, or a professional association. And it just requires so much work as well, you know, like it's hard for people who are making careers and trying to get tenure and things like this to imagine dedicating so much labor to something like this. So those are the challenges. It's possible though. It's rewarding.
I think for me, like I want to think about this like from a professional perspective, and sort of what this article that was Leila sent about the academic colonialism, was that the term? And what this means. And I guess when I start to think about particularly three things, right? Time to publish, how long it actually takes for review, and then if it gets accepted, publish, the impact factor of the journal, and then the resources you might need to pay for that publication. And I think that some of that perpetuates these cycles. First of all, that, you know, in order to do the research, you need to get the funding, and you need to, you know, get the funding, and you have to demonstrate that you're doing the research. And so that sort of cycle where if you're not publishing in what's deemed, you know, high-ranking journals or, you know, high impact factor journals, your applications for grant review might not be taken as seriously. So I think there's that sort of cycle, but then separately in my mind, there's the challenge that you face when, like, how do you, if let's say your grant run out, but now you want to publish your paper, and how are you going to do it, and you know, cover the costs, and when you don't have a ton of resources as an individual, then, you know, what should you do? How do you fund these open access costs? And then there's also funder requirements that they have to be published in open access, and that can pose a challenge both for the journal itself, which may lose out if they don't have that format, to other journals. So those are the things that I think about, both, you know, time to publish, both as an editor who's trying to get people to do review in a timely fashion, and also as someone that's trying to get review in a timely fashion for articles. And I don't have an answer for any of that, but it's part of what I think this, you know, how we can think about these differently.
Well, since I work at an old-timey kind of journal, I think I've learned a lot from my position as editor at the Annals. And maybe I'll be like the dark angel of this panel, just because, you know, Justin, when you ask, like, where do I see the future going, I'm really worried. I actually am skeptical of the kind of trajectory that we're on, even though we see diversity in the kinds of different models. You know, from my position at the Annals, I think it's important to remember that this rise of open access publishing comes in response to a changing political economy of knowledge production and our working conditions at the universities that we're at. And I thought about this before, but when I became an editor, wow, I became even more convinced about this. You know, and from my personal position, I think metrics, I think all these, like, you know, bibliometric or like tallying devices like Google Scholar, like OrcID, I think open access fees, these are just symptoms of a disease. And this is about more volume, faster speed, higher impact scores equals better. And that's the equation that not only are we kind of held to when we get promoted or tenured, but it's what we're taught. It's what the advice I see in early career mentorship given to people. Like, it's in this common, it's like the underbelly of the common refrain that I'm too tired or busy to review this article, even though I think reviewing is the collective reproductive labor that is probably one of the most important things you could do. It's about giving back to others, right? And yet that's the thing that, you know, the advice is to cut out first. And so you can imagine how that, like, these things are not sort of isolated. I think, you know, it's really nice to have discussions like this because it allows you to kind of step back and pause and ask some of these bigger questions, like what is making these conditions? What's going on at these other, you know, outlets? Where do we see kind of similar trends? Like what enables this to become hegemonic in a way? And in order to think about what we should do about it beyond just like stamping something with a gold, stamp your ticket with a gold open access, which is not really going to change the kind of fundamental interworkings of it. And I think the Annals is really interesting because it's common property. It is sort of common property of a discipline. Not to say that geographic knowledge is, you know, it's just as colonial and racist and it has its origins that need to be like constantly critiqued and revisited. But I do defend that kind of sensibility and practice of a common property. But it lives in a world that wants to piecemeal it and ring fence that knowledge. And so I see that. I think it's no accident that these kinds of new models and new journals that we see emerging are either highly specialized, like plus water, plus climate change, plus biodiversity, plus whatever, or they're within a discipline, but also specialized, like nature and space or theory and methods. Like these are two of the EP journals. You don't see anyone just creating a new geography journal. And I think that's really important to reflect on, like what are we gaining and what are we losing with these new models? And I think there's something that will be lost with an old bird like the Annals. It'll kind of move, it'll like survive on, but I think that, you know, it illustrates to me this publishing landscape that it's a game that's being played because the way to kind of bump up metrics and augment your impact factors is strategically through a topical based journal such as, you know, Frontiers and XYZ. You know, everyone loves a frontier. Like that settler colonial metaphor is never going to die. You know, you don't see frontiers in geography, right? And I think there's something to really sit back and reflect on, you know, as scholars, as practitioners, you know, as people concerned about something like household water insecurity, like where are we sending this knowledge to? What are we kind of supporting? And you know, what are the kind of bigger things going on that sort of prompt some of these trends and patterns that we see? So it's sort of a darker view, but you know, what can I say?
I do love the metaphor that so many of these issues and these unknowns are, as you put it, like symptoms of a disease. And yeah, the structural issues behind that deserve and really require a longer conversation. But given some of the questions in the chat, I want to maybe dig into some more of these symptoms. You know, one of the biggest issues with all of this change and all this transition in these publishing models is in a very practical sense. What many of our viewers probably care a lot about is how these journals are assessed in terms of promotion and tenure reviews and things like that, right? So a conversation that I haven't been hearing is how this transition period in publishing could affect early career scholars and how publication fees can potentially create silos within a scholarly community. And so let me give you an example. You have journals with article publication fees that would seem to be limited to those with significant grants, right? That's always been a critique. Then there's also potentially researchers at an elite institution who pay an institutional fee for all of their employees. My university just became one of those. I was shut out of most PLOS journals if my grant won't fund it, but our university just announced just a few weeks ago, impeccable timing for this webinar, that they bought into the PLOS subscription fee. So if you're a corresponding author at my university and anyone else that pays for that subscription, you don't pay. So suddenly, like, all the options have changed, right? For better or for worse. And then there are early career scholars with big startup funds where there's money specifically budgeted for those types of costs. And then potentially scholars in low income nations that qualify for fee waivers that some of the journals are increasingly doing. So everyone's got these perverse incentives that steer them to one set of journals or another. and of course, none of this has anything to do with the quality of the science that people are engaged in, right? So when you have other people shut out, right, because you don't fit into one of these categories, unless maybe you collaborate with someone who does, so what do we think this is a problem? How is this affecting early career scholars? We talk about that a little bit. And what do scholars that are shut out because they don't fit into one of these groups, like you don't have a big startup package, you're in between funding cycles, or you're not funded at all because it's not your mandate, you're at an R2 or an R3 university, right? Like, what do we owe those journals as reviewers? Which is maybe an even thornier topic. Like, should we review for journals that were gated from, essentially? Anybody want to jump on that?
Well, I will just say I thought that I like the idea that that Katie was discussing about, like, reviewing is a service and it is part of like how we contribute to our profession. And I want to strongly encourage you, if you get a request from me, you consider it. But it's hard. It's a hard job to ask people to do that for free. That separately, I think I actually, because I know how hard it is to get people to do it, when I get asked, I do it more often because I know the value, and and I know that, like, pretty much no one gets paid to do it. But I think maybe the goal for me when I ask people, it's because I think it's relevant to their science, or I do it because I really am interested in the science itself. So, I think this is a real challenge that we're facing in terms of what do you advise people to do, and what do you think about, in terms of your own career trajectories and what that means for you. And I do think it's, it is this model where it becomes, unfortunately, this is the biggest challenge I'm struggling with in academic career right now, is it's about putting yourself first all the time, when that's not like who I am as an individual, and I really want to bring the collective forward. And I don't, that's not generally rewarded, especially earlier on or prior to maybe promotion to full. So I don't know how because I don't think it was that maybe even 2 decades ago, but maybe that's just my perception of it. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer except to say, I think peer review is good. And, of course, it can be very challenging to either receive a difficult peer review or to do it. But I like the idea that I think it's part of the collective that we can work together on. So
I was just going to jump in on the early career point in particular. And the best advice I can give is just to ask the people who will be reviewing you before you decide on which outlets. So you could ask other people, in your broader community. But I find that every institution, every department has a particular culture around this. And I've been in 2 geography departments, 2 environmental studies department, and now the Social Justice Institute. And they're all very distinct in terms of how they talk about these issues, how they're willing to push back against things like impact factor or other metrics. So in the Social Justice Institute, we don't really care about the H-index and those factors, and we always write a narrative that says that those don't matter to us. So we want to talk about the creativity of the work, the criticality of the work, and other things, and the impact that it's had. But we sort of resist and move away from the impact factors. In some of the other departments, it's been very important. When I was at pre-tenure at Wisconsin, I published in Acme, Radical Geography Journal, Open Access, and I was told that was the biggest mistake you ever made, even though I'm very proud of that piece, and it's my highest cited piece out there. But, I was like, why? What's wrong? But I should have asked those people who would be evaluating me before I sent it off. So I think it's just really important to know what those particular narratives are, because they tend to be recycled in the same little communities, in the same rooms. So a lot of it is the imprint from 20 and 30 years ago, whatever it was, it still ends up being taken as the culture of the place. So hopefully, your institution where you'll be evaluated has a broader framing for some of these issues, or knows that something like water alternatives is also really great, even if it doesn't have some of the same metrics, for instance. And so often they're willing to go on reputation as well, and not just the impact factor. But Wisconsin wanted Annals. That was all they wanted, and so that was the goal. And if Geoform and others were also recognized, world development, et cetera. But it's really, I think, particular. So there's not general advice we can give. Besides, I would say go for a mix between journals that you care about and that you think are important for your community, and the ones that you know you're just doing the check marks if you're aiming to go through a review process, at an institution. Just like, we don't care always about student evaluations, but we do. We're always walking a line between how we understand the politics of some of those things, but also how they end up playing into those discussions. So just to be pragmatic. Yeah, thanks.
I want Casey or Katie to jump in, but I want to build on this early career theme by noting that it seems like if we keep careening towards open access, then that negotiation at the beginning of your career of startup packages that could potentially fund you could be a make or break moment, right? Depending on your institution. And I don't get the sense that that's what deans or chairs have in mind, right? That these startup packages are not supposed to just be going to publishers, right? It's supposed to be actually funding the intellectual work or field work, building capacity in terms of building out a lab and so forth, depending on your discipline. But anybody has thoughts on that or has seen creative ways that this is funded at other universities, particularly people in the audience? If you have any anecdotes about that, please drop them in the chat. Casey or Katie, you want to chime in about early career or potential silo issues?
Well, let me just say that, I am based in the UK. There are no startup packages. There's no research. There's not huge ass pockets of money for it does not rain money, so that's just one corner of the world. There's probably many other corners of the world of which the audience is representative of where that's not even an option. So again, this kind of goes back to if that's what we begin to rely on as our way towards open access, then it's just symptomatic of a system that's already broken, that the effects of which will just begin to silo, advantage some and disadvantage others. And, yeah, I think, just to kind of go back to Christine and Leila's advice was excellent. I would echo both of that, for getting to know where you work and what the expectations are. And if you can't get that, keep going back to finding mentors until you can get some clear direction and advice and mentorship. I think in terms of peer review, I appreciate the article by the Acme editors and Simon Springer around peer review being mutual aid. I like to describe it, because I'm a feminist, as socially reproductive labor, right? And with all reproductive labor, it is both generative and kind of community building, but it's also a site of exploitation. And I think that's kind of where you get that tension, that dilemma that, certain kinds of scholars get asked repeatedly, namely women, often scholars of color, to kind of do a lot more work in terms of the review work. So when I ask people to review, I'm really hypersensitive. I'm slow, but it's because I'm checking on who's reviewed for me, how many times for the journal, have they been contributing to the conversation? Are they publishing in this field? I don't just kind of slapdash invite. They're handwritten invitations to each kind of person in a way to kind of try to counter that exploitative trend towards, targeting particular kinds of people. On the other hand, I'm also pushing on particular senior scholars to say, okay, you've had your time in the Annals, now it's time to give back. And I really need your help to help advance a new early career generation going forward, since for many geography departments, a publication in the Annals is still seen as a really great part of your portfolio when you go up for tenure and promotion. The other thing about peer review and submitting is, I think, one way to kind of think about it is your article's really like a contribution to, it's a contribution towards something. So, there are journals where you might be able to transform the direction of a conversation or debate by contributing your piece. And so, at the Annals, for example, I'm always trying to ask people whose work I know is really stellar and up and coming, say, consider us, I know we're like an old bird, but we need your voices, because we need this discipline to kind of change in these ways, and you're an important role to play. So I think thinking about, reviewing as reproductive labor and what are your obligations and abilities to do that, you're not just supporting a journal, that's the tricky part. You're also supporting someone else, that author, on the other side of that written work in many ways. And I see that from my kind of little terrible chair as, crickety chair as an editor, like how much love and caring and good review work can transform and help vault something to get that into wider circulation. So it's one way to kind of think about and echo Christine's comments around reviewing, not only as, oh, I have to do this, but like, wow, I get to do this.
I would add one more thing is you get to learn. I love reviewing. I love learning what's coming out, what's emerging. And, I get a lot of my sense of the field and where it's going by being a reviewer or an editor. I would also really consider that question about what are the communities that we want to be part of, our publishing communities not as networks or things, but really sort of as processes and projects. Like what kind of a project do you want? And identifying that, because we work in institutional landscapes and some are supportive and some aren't. So you have to be very strategic about that as a junior scholar. And it's certainly important that people read your work. You don't want to publish in these great alternative journals that you love, but then no one ever reads anything you've written because they're sort of on the edges. And these big journals, they get your work out and people talk about it, and that's important too. So I think all of these things need to be taken into consideration. And I don't know if this is the right moment in our chat to talk about it, but we are really talking about North America and Europe in the publishing sort of ecology. I worked for many, many years, half my career in Latin America. Most of their journals are open access and online. And if you work in a country that has like a national sort of educational system, your work and the product of your labor is commons. It belongs to the people, and your university publishes it so that it's accessible to everybody. Just a whole different starting point for the conversation. I love dynamism and innovation and all these wonderful things that we get from this competitive ecology that we're working in the North, but it's really not the only one, and it might not be the healthiest one. So there are other models to turn to and visions of how to do this stuff.
Thanks, everybody. Really interesting perspectives covering a lot of ground here. And I did want to touch on team science. Leila, did you want to jump in before I was going to segue to
I'm just going to respond to one of the questions in the chat.
Please.
I think it's about funding for reviewers, unless I misread it. Raul and Wendy, is that correct? But this debate came up a lot in the sort of Elsevier geoform negotiations. And just to mention very briefly, the model that we came up with, rather than direct payment for reviewers, we talked a lot about the free labor and the double, triple dipping and everything that had been going on. And so basically what we came to was a model where basically roughly based on the number of peer reviews done, they would be paying into a community pool. So it wouldn't go directly to the reviewer, but it would be a community pool where the editors could then manage to give back, especially to junior scholars from the Global South or others in the community. So that would be travel bursaries, other sort of grants, mentoring programs, and other things that those resources would go to. So in the end, there's a pot of money now at Elsevier that's managed by at Geoforum in the order of $50,000 or $60,000 based on the number of peer reviews that they are getting annually. So that's just a nice way to say you need to give back to the community. This is not a one-way relationship where you can only take the labor without compensation, but it's not direct individual compensation. If I misread the question, Raul and Wendy, let us know, but we can jump on to Justin's other topic.
Yeah, that's definitely a great step in the right direction from Elsevier. Other journals are starting to do similar things where if you review a journal, you get a discount on your next submission, but that assumes that that's a place where you're publishing, right? So it's tricky how these incentives are dangled, and do we want them to be incentive based at all, right? To Katie's points. So, well, let me shift to team science. I was just wondering if these potential siloing factors where everyone's got these different incentives for publishing in different types of journals, if this seems counter to the trend in team science that a lot of research universities are starting to really push now. So if you read the science of team science literature, just says being part of these big collaborative teams multiplies your productivity. There's more innovation, just the whole team tends to perform better together when you've got a high performing team. And our HWISE collaborative has been a great example of that in the social sciences. And so when everyone has a different yardstick for evaluation, and again, coming back to promotion and tenure discussions at different universities around the country, around the world, different available funding, different perspectives on journal quality and reputation, it would seem like you could have potentially incompatible incentives when you've got a lot of people in a collaboration and you're trying to choose a target journal. So for those of you that have had experiences with large collaborative teams, and anyone in the audience, please chime in on this. Are these discussions happening? How are you seeing these things sorted out? Have you been a part of, have there been conflicts that you know of or been a part of where somebody who is at the top of the authorship list wants to publish in a certain journal and other people are uncomfortable with that, and how those conversations are taking place, but more importantly, how this stuff is being assessed for promotion and tenure, which I think is what a lot of the audience cares about and what really is still unresolved. So I know that was a lot.
Well, I'll start. I think the size of the team is different for different settings, but I think at least at my current institution, while we might discuss the importance of interdisciplinary work or team science, it's very hard to understand how that plays out in terms of your contribution unless you're first or last author or the PI on the grant. And we don't have the systems to really account for what contributions and authentic collaboration cost and really mean. And so I think as a junior faculty member, what to be successful at my institution, you need to focus primarily on things that are going to get you the things that you need, which are, PI on grants and first or senior authorship on papers. And that's not always what happens in team science, depending on the role that you're going to play. And so I think that's a real hard position for young scholars to be in. But I really, again, I think the collective is a really great place to be. And I strongly benefit from collective conversations, collective research engagement, that I'm not going to be anywhere except in the middle. And that's okay, because I probably get to still keep my job, but it's not how it's valued. And that is it's something I think I would like to figure out how to do better, either tell the story better about why my contribution is valuable to the people that are evaluating it, or how we evaluate it as a group. So I don't know. I would just like to pose the question to others.
I'd like to make one small comment, and that certainly publishing these days, especially with big group projects and now in sort of ever expanding data sets, kind of collections of data sets, that really is an enormous challenge for publishing, especially publishing the way that we do. I don't know if and that's one of the arguments that people say, like, how are you going to actually do a DIY sort of journal, an open access journal, if you don't have this massive sort of infrastructure behind you to handle this and publish things real time and have data sets available on the side. And that's a real challenge. And that's sort of, for the publishing world, that's a challenge. I think it's great that that people get involved in these team projects. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but I think that they're really rewarding. But it does mean that certain publishing, certain journals and certain publishing institutions will be much better at handling those sorts of products than others. And so I think you're sort of back to understanding why publishing houses are important in our field. And that's my comment. Thanks.
Katie or Leila, any additional thoughts about effects on collaborative teams? Otherwise, we can shift.
I'll just say, you know, team science can be really tremendously rewarding. And I think it can be an example of collective action at its best. But I am cautious about seeing it as a panacea. I think also there are plenty of circumstances where team science can just play into the game rather than transform it. In other words, it just contributes to the kind of higher octane, more faster, más gente approach to publishing rather than, you know, rather than kind of transcending that. So I think there's a kind of cautious relationship that I approach to it. I think what's interesting is, you know, stuff like that you see from feminist anthropologists and geographers who are advocating for slow science, for example, which is, you know, really, there are teams of writers, but kind of pushing back in a different way. So in other words, I think I've been part of team collectives and it's been amazing. I've been part of some where it's been less amazing, but I think it's really important to not just see it as a panacea, but to kind of think about the conditions that it's operating in, and to what extent it can kind of change or transform that, or is it just sustaining and perpetuating it? That's a question that I struggle with all the time that I don't have an answer for.
I just wanted to signal one other broader context issue that is going on in the background. So we have all the political economic considerations that we talked about, neoliberalization of the university, higher productivity, all these things are in the back there in terms of what is driving some of these. But we also have some openings in terms of who contributes to knowledge and what counts as knowledge. And so part of the resistance as well to some of the new outlets, new types of publishing, new ways of creating knowledge and more creative outputs, for instance, we also have to recognize that some of the resistance and unwillingness to sort of accept some of these new journals and outputs is also just sort of the continual attempts to keep that sort of knowledge out, other knowers and types of knowledge production. So, and that is a tension that has come up in terms of our publishing, in terms of we want to create space for different types of publications, you know, and not just all classic journal articles, but then it intersects with impact factor and other things in complicated ways at times. So if you wanted to publish poetry or artwork or other things in part of the journal. So we just have to also understand that there's like good moves in terms of opening up knowledge production, but also you have some of these ring fencing and boundary work still happening where people are trying not to acknowledge some of that space.
Okay, well, I wanted to maybe shift gears, take a step back and leave everybody with some practical knowledge about behind the scenes working with journals. And maybe we could just do quick shots, like 30 seconds per person to wind this hour down. There don't seem to be a lot of well-defined norms about how many reviews scholars should perform in a year. And from your experience in your careers and as editors and section editors, what's a typical reviewer load per year? How do editorial board appointments happen? Is this through personal networks? Do you invite star reviewers? Is it something else? Just leave everybody with a little bit of flavor around that. Christine?
Well, yeah, I will say, like, I definitely look at who has been reviewing, and I try not to ask them to do it too often. I do greatly appreciate when someone does it, and try not to, you know, ask more than one every maybe 120 days if I can think of my things on the journal. And, you know, I got asked to take this role on because I was doing a lot of reviews, and the person that was the section editor said, well, maybe you would be a good section editor, which was, you know, to me a little bit surprising. And I've enjoyed the opportunity tremendously. But it's, you know, especially like the beginning of the COVID, like everyone was home writing. And so we had a crushing number of papers to try and get through. And that was hard. But yeah, thanks.
I think I'll just say my rules of thumb, which are kind of made up based on nothing, but also based on this idea that if you're putting, you know, journals in the pipeline and those are each requiring 2 to 3 reviews, consider how much burden you're putting on the system and that you should give back at least an equal measure, if not more, especially if you're in a position of privilege higher along in your career at an institution where you have stability, et cetera, that you should probably be giving more than the burden you're placing on the system. So that would be the strict quantitative approach, so there just think about how you're engaging with it. But most of our people on our editorial board, just as an example, we say that we would expect 5 to 6 a year from you if you're on our board. I would say when I review people's CVs, I consider an active reviewer to be doing at least 8 a year, and some other people I know do 1 a month, which is, I don't think you necessarily have to do that many, but I would expect most of us, especially again, established, would be doing it around 8. So when I see someone who only does 1 or 2 a year, I'm kind of like, why aren't you doing more? That's a low number in my mind. Again, maybe unless you're junior or teaching a tremendous amount, etc.
Thanks, Leila. That's great. Casey?
Yeah, my suggestion would be that, especially for a junior scholar, to really, look at that abstract pretty closely and make sure it's something you're good at and interested in. Because again, I think if you look at it as a way to learn and a way to sort of contribute to your own process of thinking and development, then it's really a useful thing. And it's also helpful for other people. But, I've done reviews where I'm sort of at the end of the thinking, well, I don't really have much to say about this because I shouldn't have done it in the first place. And so don't get in that situation, especially if you're a younger scholar. Yeah.
Katie, any last thoughts? Or
I think Leila's advice, I try to think about maybe 3 per article that you submit. I think it's a good rule of thumb. If you're on an editorial board, again, there's like an honor with that, and there's also a little bit more expectation set on editorial board members. And just realize that for every 3 that you get, your editor might have asked 5, 6, sometimes 10 people. So there's a lot of work going on in the background. Like, I'll give you just a quantitative example. Since December 1st, I was tallying this today, I've handled 59 manuscripts. We have a special issue, so it's a little heavy now. That's roughly 236 reviewer invitations. And that's just for about 4 per paper. Some I have to go up higher. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on behind that. And I think it's worth kind of thinking about, we get great reviews. I mean, I'm stunned by the beauty, like some of them almost bring me to tears. They're like, wow, this person really sat down with your paper and like is trying to make it better. Maybe 3 in my history are like really terrible. The rest are amazing, 99.9%. So thinking about that and like at what moment, it's okay to say no. There'll be times where you need to, but think maybe I'll say yes in the future. Also, there are usually things within like the reviewing things where you're like on maternity or paternity leave or something where you can say I'm unavailable. That helps us because then we don't spend the time asking you. We know that you're out of pocket at this time. So those are things you can do to kind of help manage the reviewer request and think about what it means to kind of give back to some of these papers and when.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. I want to respect the clock and wind things down and start by thanking all our panelists and of course to the audience who's been really engaged. We settled nothing, but I hope some of you see, at least if you're early career, the rabbit hole runs deep in this area, and hope you gain some new perspectives on academic publishing and don't leave even more confused than when we started. I'll close by announcing that our February HWISE-NOW will discuss household water insecurity in colonias, led by Anais Roque and Amber Wudich. And then I'll be back in late March for another episode about water insecurity and information and communication technology. So watch the HWISE listserv or events page on the HWISE-RCN website for more details, and I look forward to seeing you at future events. Again, thanks to our panelists and our audience. Everyone take care and stay safe.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, everyone.
Well, we're winding down, Justin, but I'd love to hear more about your work with HWISE and like mobile technologies. It's an area I'm getting into with sanitation. So
we're trying to assemble a panel of people across like academia, government jobs, NGOs. I'm just talking about how different types of technology is being implemented in Walsh, and that's probably what it's I think going to be the